And I'm going to begin part 3 of this winter identification of some common oaks. And we're going to pick up where we left off. Part 1 was mostly black oak, northern red, chestnut, and scarlet. And part 2, I reviewed all those and added post oak and white oak to the series. I'm going to begin part 3 here. This is at the Copp Family Farm. This is in Center Groton, Connecticut in New London County, and only a few miles from the coast of Connecticut. And one tree that the maps show along the coast of Connecticut and up the valley of the Connecticut River itself into the area around Springfield, Massachusetts is the pin oak. So I'm not finding it too much further inland than here, but I'm finding it quite commonly in some of these habitats that remain wet during the winter months or the early spring. You can see that in the background here. And what I've got in the foreground here is a real bouldery, dry soil and great scarlet oak habitat. And I was here in November, and I'll tell you what, the scarlet oaks were ablaze in color when all the other oaks had long lost their color and their leaves. So we'll review the scarlet oak here with just a gently fissured or furrowed bark near the top of the tree, but it becomes much more textured and blocky as you near the trunk, especially on the larger trees. That one's got a lot of lichens on it. There's one right here. It's got a really good texture. It's about 1 foot in diameter. And obvious chunks and blocks at the bottom. And a smoother and fairly straight appearance as you go up. One tree that can be confused with the scarlet oak and often is not found growing along the same trail, but in this park it is, so I'm going to add it just in case you ever wonder for sure if you've got a scarlet oak or a pin oak. We'll look at the pin oaks in just a moment here. Got a scarlet oak leaf here with all those deep notches and what looks like flames from a fireplace extending out. And that's a pretty large scarlet oak leaf, about as big as my hand. And they are often smaller than that. And the remains of some acorns littering the ground, and these acorns tend to be shinier and the little scales are intact on top of the acorn, when those of a similar oak, the black oak, are not intact. So it looks like the acorn scales have been shellacked in place. Make note of this blocky bark at the bottom and the smoother bark about 10 feet up, because we've got some pin oaks right behind us here that we can compare them with. So as we make our way down off this bouldery ridge, we have a wetland here that has really only got water in it. It's about 1 foot deep, and pin oak in nature will grow in soils and is more common in soils that are wet during the months that the tree is dormant. So basically November through April or May. And that coincides with the time of year where the ground is either frozen or waterlogged, and when the trees and other plants are not transpiring the water up into the atmosphere. So often these little swales or depressions between these bouldery, ledgy areas in southern New England can provide a habitat for pin oak. And I, recorded pin oak in the Ohio Valley a couple of years ago in areas that were almost dominated by pin oak for many, many acres, because it was so flat that the water literally had nowhere to go but up. It did not go down into the ground in that habitat because it was a solid clay soil that really did not drain downward. And that forest had many, many pin oak trees. This is just a couple dozen of them growing in this little swale here. Got a couple right out here. I'm going to switch to the other side so we can get some sun on the bark of these trees. We'll make our way around this swale here, but I can just take a quick look at the silhouettes here. And see all these branches that often remain at the bottom of these pin oak trees after the branches are no longer alive or providing any functional use for the tree, except making it harder for maybe a larger animal to climb it. And again, if this land were wet year-round, we wouldn't have trees growing here, but just maybe some high bush blueberry or some sweet pepper bush or clethra. But the fact there's a stone wall going through here, this was obviously pasture at one time and does dry out during the warmer months. And right behind that old stone wall, we do have a nice pin oak with some of those branches that have not pruned off the tree. We call that self-pruning, when a tree loses its lower branches as they become shaded out by the upper part of the tree or by other trees. And if you ever planted pin oak in your yard with full sun, it will not lose those lower branches. They stick around. But in nature, often it gets this scraggly appearance with these lower branches that are dead but haven't fallen off yet. And then a nice graceful shape to the top of the tree. Got a couple dozen of these growing in this swale. Let's get a better look at some. And one reason I'm comparing the pin oak with the scarlet oak is the leaves are very similar, and the bark, at least on the mid and upper sections of the trees, is very similar. I believe I'm far enough away from those scarlet oaks that the leaves I'm finding on the ground here are from this pin oak. And these are about the size of my index finger. And yes, they do have these deep notches. And yes, the tips do look like the flames from a fire, but maybe just not quite as much. Not to the same extreme. And you're always going to find a lot of variability, but I would say that the scarlet oak leaves definitely are have more flames coming out of the fire if you look at if you look at it that way. Here's a view of a pin oak right here with a lot of lower branches. Most of them have died off, some of them haven't, but as the tree gets shaded out, these lower branches can stick around, but they're not usually alive. They look almost like a ladder going up the side of the tree. And creates a real unique appearance. They're easy to identify from a distance when they do have that. I got one right here with that scarlet oak almost like appearance up top with gently furrowed bark that continues all the way down to the trunk. And this one over here, again, has some texture at the bottom, but it's not big blocks and chunks like you find on the bottom of a scarlet oak or a black oak. And it doesn't have those slalom skier trails to any extent like you would find on a northern red oak. And we'll take a look at one more pin oak in this swale here at the Copp Family Farm. Excuse me, Copp Family Park. And I can get right up to this one. And often if there's a lot more shade on either side of the pin oak tree, and as the trees get older, they do lose those lower dead branches to the point where it isn't always a perfect way to identify the tree. But this guy still has a few little branches coming out the bottom here, and actually they still look green. So obviously it's getting enough sun. For for the tree to keep sending its resources to these lower branches. And these are very small buds on these pin oak trees. Much smaller than some of the other oaks I've already put on this series. And I haven't done much with buds because usually they're out of view. But our bark on this pin oak is just very shallow furrows. And they never get more than 1/4 inch deep, even on a 2-foot diameter tree here. And it remains that texture all the way to the bottom. So these furrows are very shallow. And the tree tends to grow straight. It tends to grow in areas where the soil remains moist during the dormant months of the year. We're going to pick up the hiking stick here and head west a few miles and try to get a good look at some Chinkapin oak to wrap up this winter series on identifying oaks. And let's continue and put the wraps on our series of barking up the right oaks in the wintertime. This is part 3. And we're at the gorge in the Housatonic River in Litchfield County, Connecticut here, near the town of Kent and the little hamlet of Bull's Bridge, which is there's an old covered bridge in the background here behind these trees. I'll give a little advice on how to see a lot of things that you don't normally see. Try to avoid the interstates. I was coming east on 84 last summer and didn't want to deal with construction delays. And yeah, it didn't save me any time coming through this scenic area, but it probably didn't cost me any time either because I had no construction delays. And instead I saw a very scenic area and discovered some Chinkapin oak growing near the eastern edge of its geographic range here. So I'm poking around these trails here, looking at these flumes and waterfalls, and the Chinkapin oak was still in leaf, and I could tell it wasn't just that oak with a very similar leaf because of the bark. And did a quick looking up of the geology of this area, and the Chinkapin oak is a lime-loving plant, and there is a pretty thick layer of marble here, which is made of limestone. Marble and limestone have the same chemistry. So the Chinkapin oak has followed this layer of marble from the Hudson Valley right over here into western Connecticut. And that's about as far east as it comes. Let's go down and we're going to make several stops here looking at these Chinkapin oaks. And there's a couple white oaks on this trail as well where we can do a quick comparison. But our Chinkapin oak will often grow right out of rocks where white oak is less likely to. It has a textured bark that's the same shade of ash gray as the white oak, but much looser to the touch. It peels off easy. It tends to be in smaller rectangles, and the texture continues the whole way up. And if you can get a good look at the buds, they're more pointed than that of the white oak. I've got a couple here I can actually see. But I try not to use buds for identification because most of the trees I'm finding while hiking are much too tall for that. But this is all marble through here, and that provides the proper soil conditions for this Chinkapin oak and a great place to explore. Kayakers often come down through here. It's mid-March. The water is not frozen. I don't know if any of them want to be out in this kind of weather. It's fairly chilly today. If anybody's more interested in what this area is like, I'm recording for Let's Dig a Little Deeper today as well. That's my other channel where I explore natural areas and untrailed areas and areas that are less known, and record a lot of the things I find, including trees. And that exploration is going to be called Ascending Shattuck Mountain on the Appalachian Trail, and the hike starts right here. The Appalachian Trail actually follows the river here and then ascends about 1,000 feet higher to the summit of Schaghticoke Mountain. And as we climb up from that little area we just explored, boy, this is all Chinkapin Oak in here, folks. Not a white oak hanging out right on this ledge, but there is some right up the trail we'll look at. And if I hadn't stopped here in the summer and hadn't checked the geology map, I would have easily passed this over as white oak. Probably would have keyed in on its identity if I'd really stopped and looked. But just like the post oak, it can be easily confused. No post oak in this area according to the range maps. I'm sure there's places where we could do a side-by-side comparison of post oak and Chinkapin oak in southern Ohio, where I did both of them, but I don't have any available here for that. But obviously they could be confused by the bark, but not by the leaves. So all kinds of Chinkapin oak growing back here with this much looser bark than our white oak, but almost identical in color. And just up the hill from the Bull's Bridge here, the old covered bridge, we've got some more Chinkapin oak. I'm walking along, this sure says white oak to me by the color. And there is white oak to be found on this island in the Housatonic River. But I'm also seeing a little bit more blocky, squarish blocks, looser blocks in this bark than a white oak. I found a Chinkapin oak leaf on the ground, which looks just like a chestnut oak leaf. The good news is that Chinkapin oak is a lime-loving plant, and there is a thick layer of marble here that is based, as limestone that's been metamorphosed for it to grow on. And the chestnut oak is an acid-loving plant, and there's plenty of acid soils in this area, but not on this particular ledge here. This is all marble right here. I had to double check the geology maps. But as we look up this tree, we just don't see those large flakes that are attached on one side that can be 4 to 6 inches long. It's consistently even texture, just like our black oak, but much lighter in color. The nickname for this Chinkapin oak is yellow oak, and it's just got a slightly yellow hue compared to a white oak. And when I did the study on white oak last year, I did some direct comparison using paint strips from Sherwin-Williams and showed the different shading of the white oak versus the Chinkapin oak. And if you're around them enough, you can tell them apart just by the shade of the bark and this texture. But I'm putting it on this series because they are difficult to tell apart. But a nice bright day for us to study them. The buds are slightly different, but most of the time they're out of view. And just up the trail from that Chinkapin oak, I've got several medium-sized white oaks here to do a close-by comparison. And this is a very scenic time of year, winter and spring. You get both in the same week often. Today's highs in the upper 20s, supposed to be near 60 in a few days. So here's our white oak with that ash-colored bark, wood-colored bark. And the way I can tell for sure it's a white oak and not a Chinkapin oak is it does have these flakes that are attached on one side but not the other. I call them vertical flakes. I'm sure there's a botanical name for it that I'm not familiar with. And where it is in blocks, the blocks tend to be more rectangular and less square than that of the Chinkapin oak. And I'm going to put the wraps on this 3-part winter oak identification series. I've had a great time making these videos. I've done 4 different hikes actually. 3 different day hikes and 1 shorter hike to see those pin oaks. And I've had pretty good luck with the weather. And today is definitely the most scenic day with this fresh snow cover and blue sky. And very, very nice scenery too. So on this particular day, I've gotten 7 of the 9 oaks. And my goal was to compare the Chinkapin oak with the white oak. And shortly after that, climbed up Shattuck Mountain here. And there are videos from that part of the day on my other channel. The channel's called Let's Dig a Little Deeper. Well, let's enjoy the view from the top of this ledge here. And we're going to continue on with some tree ID. March is half gone. I wouldn't expect to get too much till sometime in April, maybe early May. I'm far enough north that I could actually still do some winter ID in April in central New England, and some summer ID pretty much after Memorial Day, because leaf out is late in this part of the country, especially if you get near the cold waters of the Atlantic. But we've got a great view here from Schaghticoke Mountain, some nice open ledges, and the Appalachian Trail and the Appalachian Mountains continue to our south and southwest for many, many miles. We're about 1,400 miles into the 2,100 mile long Appalachian Trail, and the hike I did today and this overlook is on that Appalachian Trail. We're looking south towards Danbury, Connecticut here, and we'll look forward to doing more of these adventures and tree IDs in the next 6 to 8 weeks.